Hello and welcome to Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty. I'm here today at the Federal Courthouse in Lower Manhattan where it's absolutely chucking it down. Just a warning, this episode contains descriptions of violence, sexual violence and graphic descriptions of sex. Sean Diddy Combs is accused of sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution and racketeering with conspiracy. He denies all the charges and says he's never sexually assaulted anyone, man or woman, adult or minor. If found guilty, he could end up spending the rest of his life behind bars. As you know, Shaun Diddy Combs' trial is ongoing, but this is our episode where we round up all the big developments from court during the week, starting with the testimony of rapper Kid Cudi, who was in the court today. Later, we're going to be hearing from criminal defense attorney Shaun Kent with his stellar analysis of what's been going on, and he's going to be answering some of your questions. So what have we seen this week in court? We've had pictures of baby oil, Astroglide, boxes of 7-inch heels that were found in the raids on Diddy's Miami home. We've seen components of an AR-15 held up for the jury to see. We've heard from a male exotic dancer called The Punisher. We've also heard from Cassie's mum, and that was before the week was even over. Now, I'm joined by the BBC's New York correspondent, Nada Tawfik, who's going to break down everything we've seen this week. Nada, everybody wants to know about Kid Cudi. That's the star witness of today. What went down in court?
Well, before Kid Cudi took the stand, we actually heard more from George Kaplan, who was an executive assistant of Diddy's for a while. George Kaplan really gave us, again, this picture of Diddy as a larger-than-life figure, right? He even used the word icon. He said, the size of his business was the size of the earth, essentially. When the defense asked him if he had fun with him, he's like, I wouldn't call it that. But he said, just like other relationships, theirs was complicated, and that ultimately he decided to leave his dream job because he just couldn't tolerate and put up with how Diddy had treated how he described his two girlfriends, Cassie and Gina. He said those kind of tense and angry moments where he said that he didn't see the women injured, but he could hear and tell there was kind of violence in that relationship.
The bit that really stuck out for me with George was he was talking about being a young man working for him, and he was like, this God amongst men is talking to me.
Yeah, actually, the person interviewing him pointed to a picture of Diddy on the wall and said, this is Diddy's kingdom, and we're just all here to serve. And we also heard from the prosecution in opening statements, right, that Diddy referred to himself as a king. So they're building up this picture consistently throughout testimony. And this is really to show the jury, look, this is numerous people now saying the same thing, that they witnessed the violence, that Diddy was volatile, that he wanted everyone to essentially serve him without question.
Which brought us onto the testimony of Kid Cudi.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me about Kid Cudi, who was referred to obviously by his real name, Scott Muscuddy, was he really was himself on the stand. He didn't come in soft-spoken or, timid or somber at all. He was there kind of stretching in between questions when needed and breaks and answering questions in a very unfiltered way. So, when he describes two instances that were kind of the most graphic, obviously. One where he alleges Diddy broke into his home, and then another where he alleges that Diddy or one of his associates threw a Molotov cocktail into his Porsche. He said he called Diddy when he heard he was in his house saying, "Mother effer, are you in my house?" Like, that's what he recalled saying to Diddy. And apparently Diddy told him, "I'm over here waiting for you." When he got there, Diddy wasn't there. But then also later, because the court was shown these pictures of his car with a hole in the soft rooftop, the doors open, all of it kind of soot everywhere, the car burnt out. And he was asked, what was your reaction when you saw the car? And he said, I said, what the F? So, it's just a regular person's reaction to finding yourself in the situation where you thought, the girl you're seeing is no longer with someone that you work with in the music industry. And the defense played on that, saying, Cassie played you the way she played him. You thought they were apart. And he acknowledged that, yeah, I thought they were broken up. And so he talks about how the relationship ended because it just got out of control. He said the drama got out of control. He thought also he needed to give Cassie space because things were just getting so heated and they both needed space for their safety.
One of the most interesting things in Kid Cudi's recollection of events was when he spoke about what happened after the fact. Like, him and Cassie had broken up, but they had this kind of three-way meeting, I guess. hashing out issues with him, Diddy, and Cassie.
Yeah, so just to set the scene, Kid Cudi says, after my car was blown up, I thought I should probably talk to Diddy. He says they agreed to meet at Soho House in Hollywood. When he gets there, Diddy's security guard escorts him to a room that on one side is filled with windows. And he describes Diddy looking like a Marvel supervillain. He used that exact phrase. He said Diddy was looking out the window, his hands were kind of clasped behind his back. And so Kid Cudi just approaches him, and he said Diddy was eerily calm to the point where it was almost unsettling for Cudi. He said it was weird. He kept offering me water. He was very calm. But he said they talked through the scenario. Eventually, Cassie joined, which he didn't expect, and it made him a little sad. And then at the end of the meeting, he says they left it where they just got up and shook hands. And he said, I took that opportunity, looking him in the eye, shaking his hand to say, what about my car? And he said, Diddy responded, I don't know what you're talking about. So that was a moment where, Cudi was like, okay. Eventually he sees Diddy a few years later, again at Soho House. Diddy was there with his daughter. And he said Diddy came to him and just apologized and said, sorry for all the BS. And he said, at that point, I just made peace with it. I wasn't expecting anything more from him.
The defense made a point of saying a few times, like, Cassie played both you and Diddy because Diddy didn't know that she was with you and you didn't know that she was still with Diddy. And they emphasized that a few times.
Yeah, look, I mean, this goes back to their opening statement, the defense. They keep trying to paint Cassie as somebody who cheated on Diddy, and Diddy as somebody who was just insanely jealous as well, and that jealousy made him volatile. It's this effort to show that actually there wasn't a power dynamic, that Diddy didn't hold the power the way the prosecution say he did, that this was just a toxic relationship, both parties at fault.
And that was today. And now we're going into a 4-day weekend?
Memorial Day weekend, yeah. So here in the U.S., Monday is a federal holiday. People are off, but also here in court, they get Friday off. And so the judge actually told everyone, good job. You've been making great progress this week. It's a well-deserved break. He told the lawyers, I'm sure you're going to go sleep now. And reminded the jury that it's a long break, so just to make sure not to talk to anybody about this case, not to look up anything, and just thanking them for their service.
And that wraps up the second week of the trial of Sean Diddy Combs. But for people who haven't been following along every single day, if we could just round up the week, Monday, I felt, was kind of all about Kerry Morgan, which was Cassie's best friend. I thought the stuff that she had to say was really interesting in painting a picture of what Cassie's life was like at the time.
She actually hasn't been in touch with Cassie for years. They've had a falling out. So unlike the defense's attempt to paint other characters as like overly sympathetic to Cassie, Kerry Morgan is seen as somebody who is neutral, right? She was her best friend for 17 years. They met in high school. But her testimony went into two different instances where she said Diddy was overly aggressive with Cassie. And look, the picture she paints is of Cassie, someone who she said had completely lost her spark after years with Diddy, kind of cowering and being very afraid of Diddy and actually hiding out at times for hours, as was in the case in Jamaica when she kind of ran after Diddy apparently grabbed her by her hair because she was taking too long in the bathroom and dragged her out the house and threw her down, her head hitting a brick. But she also talked about on cross-examination how they all had fun together, that this was very much a loving dynamic. These weren't just Diddy's employees, they considered them friends, and when she stopped talking to Cassie, it was a big loss in her life to lose the rest of those people. So again, it was the defense trying to show this isn't racketeering. These aren't employees that are helping Diddy be a criminal mastermind. They were all friends. This was a great type of relationship too. But Kerry Morgan, under the direct examination, made it very clear that oftentimes, she would look to the security guards or others to see if they were going to do anything about Diddy hitting Cassie, and nobody would step up.
And the breakdown of their relationship was interesting because Kerry alleges that she was assaulted by Diddy. He put his hands around her throat and threw a wooden hanger at the back of her head. She said that the way that Cassie dealt with that was ultimately what caused the breakdown of a 17-year friendship, like you said.
Yeah, she said that she hired a lawyer after that, but that Cassie asked her to meet at a pizza joint and told her she was milking it and she was over-exaggerating what had happened to her. And then she handed her a non-disclosure agreement and $30,000. And Carrie at that point took it. But she said she was really hurt that Cassie wasn't taking her side, and she didn't speak to her since. And she, noted, even though Cassie's moved on with her life, Cassie hasn't reached out to her either. So Cassie, prosecutors set that up a bit early on. Talking to Cassie about why she's testifying in this case. And Cassie spoke about how she knows she hurt a lot of people and didn't treat them the way they should have been treated at the time, and she's carried that guilt. And so part of this for her is part of that healing and closure.
And then on Tuesday, we actually got a chance to hear from Cassie's mum, but it wasn't the longest testimony. And to be honest, I expected her to get quite emotional on the stand, but that wasn't really what happened.
Yeah, that's right. You would figure Cassie's mom, they'd want to go into many details, but, Cassie testified how she really kept a lot from her mother. But we know that there was that email she wrote, again, going back to Kid Cudi, when Diddy found out about the relationship. Cassie on the stand talked about the threats he made and threatening to release one of the freak-off videos on Christmas Day and another after, and threats to her life and Cudi's. And so her mother just essentially took the stand saying when she got the email, she was just essentially devastated to receive that. And then she detailed an instance where Diddy demanded $20,000 from the family. And Cassie's mom said they paid that, but that a few days later, I think 4 days later, Diddy gave the money back. So her testimony was quite brief, but again, trying, I think, for prosecutors to show that this was blackmail, coercion, all part of their case.
After that, we had some testimony from somebody called the Punisher. Now, I get it. I get why that is number one in the headlines. The name itself is pretty stops you in your tracks. But it was similar stuff to what we'd heard from the previous male commercial sex worker. And also, Nada, just tell us where he actually got that name from.
So he carried it from his youth, apparently playing basketball with his friends. That's what they used to call him, the Punisher. So maybe not the backstory people were expecting for an escort with that name, but he carried it on. And look, I think we have to remind people that, there are salacious details that come out in these types of cases, but there is a very practical reason why they're having these escorts testify. One of the charges is transport to engage in prostitution. And so the government just really does need to show that somebody was transported across state lines and paid for sex. So you get that in this testimony. And yeah, just like the other escort, he kind of detailed what was expected in those freak-offs and how it all went down.
We also had testimony from a Homeland Security officer who was part of the Miami raids on one of Diddy's homes, and he testified about finding the ingredients that other witnesses have told us are the essentials for a freak-off.
Yeah, that's right. And this is the Miami home. I'm sure we're going to get to the LA home. But the agent spoke about how, they get a list of items to look for when they conduct these searches. And there were photos shown of everything from the baby oil that we've heard plenty about to lingerie and high heels and drugs in Gucci bags and other places. But we also saw, for example, the different gun parts and guns that were found in the home. Some were wrapped in towels, some were in kind of suitcases in clothes. And the government made the point to address that serial numbers were scratched off some of these guns, and that essentially just makes it harder to trace where the gun came from. But the defense then came back, asking about whether DNA was collected, saying that that's another way to pull hair samples, fingerprints from these guns to find out who they belong to. But the agent wasn't the one to conduct any of that forensic examination after the fact, so he couldn't say whether that was done or not. So again, we just kind of see the defense trying to, poke holes, take the sting out of some of the testimony, because at the end of the day, Diddy is presumed innocent until the government proves their case and the jury finds that they have. And so they never know what's going to resonate with the juries.
Nada, thanks so much for coming and breaking that down for us.
Always a pleasure.
So now I'm back in the BBC Bureau, and as always, I am ready to unpack what has been going on this week with our resident criminal defence attorney, Shaun Kent. Hi, Shaun.
Hey, how are you doing?
Shaun, the first thing that I want to ask you about is this Kid Cudi testimony. We've been waiting for it. He was kind of a star witness in his own right. We got the testimony today. It wasn't quite what a lot of folks were expecting. How did it play out for you?
From what I was reading and the way it played out to me, candidly, it didn't sound like the United States proved arson. They proved suspected arson. What I was surprised about, what I was shocked about, is I thought the United States would or could have offered immunity to somebody who actually burned the car, and they were going to come in and testify and say, Cudi told us that his car was thus, and Diddy is the person who burned the car. That was the assumption. But instead, it was just Cudi basically saying that Puff Daddy is a Marvel supervillain.
How can he say things about Diddy with no corroborating evidence? Why couldn't they just be like, well, that's his own opinion. There's no facts.
The first rule that we hear all the time is hearsay. A long phrase for saying that if somebody says something about me, they need to be there. So it's sort of like you can't talk in rumors. She said this and he said this. Well, that person needs to be there. Unless it's an actual defendant, as in Diddy.
How come no one said when he said, I went up to that room and he looked like a Marvel villain? How come they didn't say, well, Judge, I don't know, leading the, I don't know.
That could have been an objection. That's a present impression, but that is his impression of what he saw and what it looked like. To me, he looked like this. This is my opinion on how he looked. Could they have objected? Yes. And sometimes you got to be careful because you said it. We say the word objection, Judge, this is a problem. And the problem is it then highlights it to the jury because the jury's already heard it and you're saying objection. And you have to be careful. The jury's like, why is the defense trying to hide stuff? But that Marvel supervillain visual, I still have it in my head, seeing Diddy in the room. And of course, that amazing testimony that Diddy and his boys broke into his house and opened his gifts and hid his dog inside of the room. That's like a skit from a movie.
Yeah, so the part of the testimony went quite hard on the fact that, well, Cassie was playing both of you because she told you she was single, she told Diddy she was single. I don't see how this is building a RICO case.
Have you noticed they keep sprinkling in some of the Secret Service agents who are talking about the stuff that they have found in some of the places, and they talk about the computers? I'll be very curious if towards the end of some of this information is going to be a lot of stuff that were found on the computers that ties a lot of this information in. Because what has ended up happening with Kid Cudi's testimony is he's actually, to me, from the reading of it, hurt the credibility of Cassie's testimony, who is supposedly their star. And it's the United States isn't doing a good job of building Cassie up, but through their witnesses, they're also knocking down her credibility, knocking down that she's a victim, and possibly making the jury just not like her.
And then, so if we take a step back and look at the rest of the week, because it's been a pretty packed week and we don't even have a Friday because it's a holiday. We've had Cassie's best friend, ex-best friend on the stand. We've had two different assistants. First of all, Cassie's best friend, what did you make of what she had to say?
I'm taking this now in the lens because we've also already had the expert testify. And so to me, it was clear that the purpose of Cassie's best friend was to go for the expert. And you watch the expert testimony. The assumption is that the expert was going to testify to the fact that when people are finding themselves in these situations, they start to isolate. And so the purpose of putting her best friend was in there is to show that this was isolation, that she hasn't talked to her anymore, that she has isolated herself from friends, what checks off some of the stuff the expert is saying.
Yeah, so we had the expert testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes, like people might be familiar from they might be familiar with her. She's appeared in other trials. And like you say, she did outline what she kind of described as the steps of abuse. So we have isolation, we have devaluing, we have discarding, and then we have things like love bombing. So you're constantly trying to return to that state where there's love and there's kindness, and it kind of goes in a circular motion with alleged victims, which is why they might not choose to leave. So I understood that from how she was tying in the testimony of Cassie's ex-best friend, who did seem to have extra credibility purely on the fact that she doesn't like Cassie, and they haven't spoken.
Cassie doesn't talk to her, not a friend of hers whatsoever. Those to me are always the most credible witnesses. She made it clear, I don't want to be here. I'm not friends with her. The government has subpoenaed me to make me be here. and I'm still telling you my truth. I still watch the abuse. That guy over there is not a good person.
I don't understand the decision making that the lawyers go through when they're deciding how they're going to be with people, because her testimony was not positive for the defense. But Mark Agnifilo, he was funny, he was light on his feet, he was complimentary, she was laughing, he was laughing, the room was laughing, and everybody kind of took a step out of how serious and quite dark it's been for the rest of the time that we've been in there. You know, they were joking about modeling, she was joking about being old, etc., all these different things. But then David James takes the stand, who is a former executive assistant of Diddy, who is saying similarly damaging things. But the vibe between him and Mark Agnifilo was tense, it was combative. I mean, at one point, David James was like, "You're asking bad questions." You know, everybody in the room I was in was like, "Ooh, what's going on?" How do you pick and choose? Do they pick and choose? Would you pick and choose how you act with somebody? And what's the logic behind that?
You absolutely do. There's an unwritten rule, and I think I've talked to you about this before. Happy jurors don't convict, you know? And so what you want to try to do is you always want to make a witness your own witness. You want to make a witness on your side. And so if the person is giving you the information, you don't attack them because you don't have to. And you usually try to make that choice. Most good lawyers, and Diddy's team is filled with great lawyers, they make that choice during direct testimony, how this person is acting when they're talking to the United States. And so the assumption is when Mark was watching her testify, he knew she will give me information without being combative, so I will be nice to her. And the opposite, he probably saw that this witness, and maybe they have talked, maybe they have seen his interviews, and they said, this witness will not be good to me, so I need to go after him. There's an art to cross-examination to make sure you get your point across. And we don't know, because all the defense attorneys know the smoking gun that the federal government has. And so maybe there is a reason that they're saying something else is coming out, and that's the witness I need to go after.
And then that brings me on to George Kaplan, who we had today, who was the second executive assistant that they spoke to. Once again, completely different vibe, very positive. I mean, George Kaplan's testimony, a lot of it was quite positive about Diddy. You know, he inspired me. I'd never be where I am today if it wasn't for the business training that he'd given me and about work ethic, etc. You know, they were asking him about what it was like to work at Bad Boy when you were younger, when he had the job. And he was like, well, I was this young guy and here was this God amongst men talking to me. So I was like, oh, that reminded me of David James's testimony. And they spoke about this in the defense's opening statements, that he did refer to himself as a king.
It sounds RICO-like, if you want to be technical. Racketeer, influence, corrupt organization is the way that I look at it, that they're helping the United States prove that this is a corrupt organization. And everybody keeps missing it. Not missing it, but the federal government has made it clear. The purpose of this organization was to help Diddy with his commercial sex acts. That is the overreaching purpose, if you will, of this organization. The purpose of the arson was because somebody who he had a commercial sex act, Cassie, had left him. All of these things were tied into helping Diddy with his butt naked baby oil freak off parties. And to me, calling this, he's this cult-like creature, he is this god-like creature, this is going along with what the government is saying, that this is an organization all at one purpose, to make that guy feel good.
As you know, because I talk to you a lot about the questions that we're getting from people. This one says, thank you for the podcast. Finding the legality of the trial very interesting. I have a question regarding consent. So this has come up a lot. Presumably, consent can be withdrawn up until the moment of the act. And during so, if Cassie were to allege that she may have sent those messages to placate him, so messages saying, I always want to freak off, I'm ready for a freak off whenever you are, etc., to placate him, and then at a later time withdrew consent, and she testified this, can that not negate Diddy's presumption of consent from those? This is a really good question.
The smartest question I've ever seen in my life.
Bro, our listeners are smart, man. What can I say?
There you go.
So yeah, so she's putting consent in black and white in these texts, but absolutely consent can be withdrawn. So how does that work in the eyes of the law?
You're exactly right. I mean, that's how it works in the eye of the law. At the end of the case, the judge is going to give jury charges, okay? And the jury charges is when he tells the jury what the law is. And he will be able to tell the jury if somebody requests about consent, when can consent be withdrawn, and so forth. Now, that was also from the United States. Consent can be withdrawn at any point in time. Every woman does know that. It doesn't matter what the relationship, doesn't matter a marriage. At any point in time, a woman can take away the consent to her own body. And the law absolutely agrees with that.
The next one is, well, this has come up a lot. Do you think the defense could call ex-girlfriend Jennifer Lopez, Diddy's ex, as a character witness? If not, why not?
That, believe it or not, is a really good question, because usually we do not let actions of good character come into evidence. You can't just randomly put someone's good character evidence, because when you put in someone's good character, what that does is it opens the door to the United States to put in the bad character. So then the United States could put in what's called a rebuttal case. So let's say Diddy's case is to put 20 women who say, you know what, he never assaulted me. He was a great boyfriend to me. He was an awesome person to me. You remember all in that fighting that the defense did at the beginning of the trial that says, we don't want these prior sexual assaults. We don't want these prior accusations. We want all these things that they're accused of. Keep that out. Well, they put in his good character. All of that stuff comes in because the United States gets to talk about his bad character. So no, I don't think there's any way in the world they would bring Jennifer Lopez or any ex-girlfriend to come in there and talk about how wonderful of a person he is.
Shaun, thank you so much for breaking that down for me this week. I'll see you next Thursday. Guys, please keep sending in your questions. I mean, those questions today, they were brilliant.
Those are really good questions. I was like, good guy back in a law school exam. What is that?
You need to start doing some recruiting. So Shaun's practices in South Carolina, if anybody wants to go and check it out.
Thank you for the emails that I'll be getting now.
I can come and make the tea. Actually, I'm not so good at tea. Coffee. I could come and make the coffee. Shaun, thank you so much. We'll see you next week for another Thursday
Thank y'all for
roundup.
having me. I much appreciate it. Thank you so much.
That was our resident criminal defense attorney, Shaun Kent from South Carolina. And that's it for this episode of Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss a thing, and keep sending us your questions at +44 330 123 551. That's +44 330 123 551.